no longer money. American citizens weren't allowed to own gold from 1933 onward. No one could convert dollars into gold. Okay, so gold was a non-monetized asset, or a demonetized asset by that time. Right? So when the government was purchasing gold, this would have caused a great inflation. As they purchased gold, those new dollars would have found their way into the banking system in 1936, and it would have increased the money supply. So rather than have that happen, let's say they purchased $1 million of gold. They would then have created $1 million that could have been become part of bank reserves and increase the money supply. Well, to offset that, what the Treasury did was when it purchased the gold and issued the $1 million, it bought back the $1 million by selling government securities to the extent of $1 million. So basically, it neutralized the inflow of gold on the United States. In fact, people at the time called it a golden avalanche. There was an avalanche of gold pouring into the U.S. because of this policy of Roosevelt of valuing the dollar, which meant increasing the price of gold in terms of dollars. So gold was more valuable in the United States than elsewhere. You get more dollars for it in exchange for which you could then buy American products and so on. So you had this avalanche of gold. And the Treasury properly did not allow this to affect the money supply. Okay? So from 34 to 36, we had an enormous increase in the money supply as a result of this policy. The money supply increased at rates of 14% in 1934, 14.8% in 1935, and 11.4% in 1936. Money supply was increasing at double-digit figures, okay, or at double-digit rates during this period. And it was in 1936 then that the Treasury decided to stop that increase in the money supply by what they called sterilizing or neutralizing the effect of this gold inflow. The other point I wanted to make is that, let's say, even if gold were still money, okay, according to the currency school, when gold flows in, if you have a fractional reserve system, what's going to happen is that the money supply is going to increase by a multiple of gold. So let's say if you have $1 of gold flowing in, the money supply could increase by $10. So there's nothing wrong with, even if gold were money, which it was not, there's nothing wrong with sterilizing the extra $9 of reserves that would have come into existence as a result of gold flowing in. That's the currency school policy. Under 100% gold standard, when $1 worth of gold flows in, the money supply increases by $1, period, end of story. But under a fractional reserve system, when $1 flows in, you can have an increase in the money supply up to a maximum of $10 if the rate of the reserve ratio or the proportion of deposits you have to hold in reserve, if that's 10%, then you could get a money multiplier or a deposit multiplier of 10. Okay. And by the way, as Hayek pointed out, that when you have a fractional reserve gold banking system, even on a gold standard, when you have a balance of payments inflow, as that money those gold reserves get into the banking system, and there's a multiplication of checking account money, that money is loaned out through credit markets, pushes down the interest rate, and brings about the business cycle, an inflation followed by a depression, by distorting the interest rate. So even under fractional reserve gold standard, as, by the way, the currency school saw, and as Mises saw, you still get the business cycle. Right? Now, it's not as severe as it would be under a paper money, but it still can occur. All right. All right. Finally, Timberlake objects to the Fed's policy of raising reserve requirements in 1936 and 1937. Okay. Now, the Fed did this because there were a massive amount of excess reserves that the banks were not lending out. Okay. And they were afraid that once the banks lent out these excess reserves that they had piled up in the 1930s, there would have been a multiple expansion of bank deposit money, and as a result, you would have gotten a large inflation of the money supply. Okay, and that's a correct analysis. Okay, but Timberlake advances two criticisms against this policy. First, he says the policy was unnecessary because even if the excess reserves that existed on the eve of its implementation, even if they were all fully loaned out by the banks, the inflationary potential was relatively minor. Okay, Timberlake says that the 52% increase in the money supply that would have been a 52% increase in the money supply. He said that was only mildly inflationary, because the larger money supply would have exceeded the needs of trade of a fully employed economy by 5.6% at 1929 prices, which was about 25% higher than the prices prevailing in June of 1936. Now, here's what he's saying. He's saying because prices have fallen so much from 1929 to 1936, that there's nothing wrong with the money supply exploding by 52%. Okay? Because that increase in the money supply by 52% would simply drive prices up back to their 1929 levels, maybe a little bit beyond that, about 5% beyond that. Okay? And that's a good thing. Well, that's just straight inflationism. It's saying, or reflationism. It's saying that we get out of a depression by simply reflating the money supply, by simply creating more paper money and restoring the old level of prices. And that will put people back to work and get us moving again. But all that does is sow the seeds for a further business cycle. So in plain language, Timberlake is literally defining away a potential money and price inflation of huge proportions because of he perceives it as expedient in expanding employment and output and extricating the economy from a depression. Basically, he wants the Fed to allow the banks to inflate us out of the recession. Okay, he wanted to leave the excess reserves there. As the banks began to loan them out and the money supply increased, we could inflate our way out of a recession. And of course, that's contrary to the Austrian view that you have to have adjustments. And some of these adjustments may very well include, as banks collapse and as people pull their currency out of banks, a reduction in the money supply, and therefore prices should be reduced. The second criticism Timberlake has of this policy is that the increase in reserve requirements went way beyond closing off a potential area of recovery for the economy and actually turned it into another recession. Okay? So he's claiming that this policy resulted in a deflation of the money supply that brought about another recession within the existing depression. The U.S. economy was beginning to recover, and he claims that recovery was aborted by Fed's policy. But again, let's look at Timberlake's data. If you look at the money supply as defined by M2, which is what Timberlake prefers, that grew from $43 billion to $45 billion, or by 4.4% in the year between June 1936 and June 1937. Okay? That was the year in which the Fed implemented that policy of mopping up the excess reserves. Okay? So you didn't have a deflation. You had a lower rate of inflation, but you certainly didn't have a deflation. Okay? Even in the last 6 months of the period, the money supply wasn't deflated. Okay? It increased by a very low rate, slightly below 1% per year. So even from Timberlake's monetarist standpoint, it's really difficult to blame that recession of 37-38 on deflationary Fed policy. Okay? The Fed policy wasn't really deflationary. At most, it reduced the rate of inflation. At most. In any case, Timberlake's emphasis on Fed deflationism as the cause of this problem causes him to ignore a very plausible Austrian explanation of why we had a recession within the Depression. Okay? And recently, Veteran Galloway's book called Out of Work, which I highly recommend, uses sort of an Austrian approach to explain why the Depression lasted as long as it did. What happened in 1937, which was ignored, was the following. Well, actually, it happened initially in 1935. In 1935, the Supreme Court upheld the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. They upheld it as constitutional. This act set up the National Labor Relations Board, and it put in place mandatory collective bargaining. So if 51% of the members of a bargaining unit, let's say either a firm or a plant, voted for a union, the other 49% were stuck with that union, even if the higher union wages and benefits caused them to become unemployed. They could not bargain to work for a lower wage. Okay? So mandatory collective bargaining was imposed in 1935. So money wages, not unsurprisingly, jumped by 13.7% in the first 3 quarters of the year. So during a depression, wages jumped by 13.7%. Okay? This sudden jump in the price of labor far outstripped the increase in output prices. Okay? So now what you had was profit margins were being squeezed tremendously by this increase in the price of labor or wages, which went beyond the increase in output prices. What did that cause? Well, according to Austrians or to any really good neoclassical economists, if you have an increase in costs, okay, and no increase in prices, or very little increase in prices, that's going to squeeze profit margins. It's going to cause layoffs, and that can explain that. Now, more research has to be done there, but that can certainly explain the recession. And in fact, if you look at the monetary data, you find that the large upward spurt in excess reserves, okay, and then the accompanying decrease in the money supply that we observe in Timberlake's data between June 30th and 37 and June 30th, 38. So there was a decrease in money supply later on. Why would the banks suddenly increase their excess reserves even more? Okay, well, you're in the middle of another recession. Businesses aren't doing good. They're not demanding loans, or you're very, very reluctant to lend them money because you're fearful that they'll fail and default on the loan. Okay.